Well, hello everybody. It is Thursday, May 16th in the year beyond Thunderdome 2013. Although, don't be postponing the apocalypse just yet, because this has been an interesting week geopolitically and for me, because I continue to be misunderstood by certain people in my comments about Vladimir Putin. So, at the risk of uh, being misunderstood even more, I'm going to try and clarify some things. But it's been an interesting week, and the context of my remarks is the fact that Israeli Premier Bibi Netanyahu, or whatever his name is, has gone to Beijing and then on to Moscow. And that is an interesting geopolitical turn of events. If we dial the calendar back a few years, the idea of an Israeli prime minister going to Beijing or Moscow would have been unheard of. Washington, D.C., yes. London, yeah. Maybe even Berlin. But Beijing and Moscow, that signals the fact, I think, that many other commentators have noticed that the relationship between the United States and Israel has certainly frosted under the Obama administration. Not that personally I think that's a bad thing, but not that I think it's a good thing. I'm not anti-Israel. I do think that that nation has the right to exist. But I'm not pro-Israel in that I do not accept the biblical claims that many advance for justifying its existence there. All right? So we have a lot to talk about. What interests me is that not only does this signal perhaps a shifting geopolitical reality, a recognition on Israel's part perhaps, that it has to come to some sort of understanding with Russia and China. Otherwise, this mess in the Middle East is simply not going to be able to be worked out along the old Israel, United States, United Kingdom nexus. And that certainly, I think, is true. All of this highlights two stories that have also come to light in the past couple of weeks. And I hope, to address some of these points in some upcoming blogs because they're intensely complex. Uh, I have no doubt that the limitations of space and time in blogging these things is going to open me up to more misunderstanding. But there are those of you who know what I'm talking about, where I'm coming from. The first is that the state of Texas recently passed a Texas Israel Day. The state legislature in Texas passed what are, in my opinion, so many politically and theologically goofy resolutions in support of the state of Israel, not the least of which is an official state recognition that this land belongs to Israel by dint of the claims of the Old Testament, all right? Which raises certain interesting theological conundrums because, as all of you know, I have made it very clear, and it is true, that classical Christian doctrine, the doctrine of the Eastern Orthodox, or if you prefer, the Russian Orthodox Church, the doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church, and all forms of classical Protestantism, Lutheranism, Calvinism, the Reformed tradition, and so on. In none of these traditions does a restoration of Israel play any role, for the simple reason that Christian teaching concerning the incarnation, sacrifice, and resurrection of Christ nullifies, in the Christian doctrine, any claim of any group to special divine status, including the Jews. Now, that may be offensive to some people, but I'm simply telling you this is the historical Christian tradition. I don't care what modern American televangelists are telling you. I'm simply saying this is a matter of history and a matter of traditional Christian doctrine. I don't approve one way or the other of the doctrine. When the Texas legislature did this, it is kind of sealing the influence of that part of American evangelicalism that influences American politics and therefore American foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel. And of course, it took a Democratic president under Obama to challenge this whole assumption, and that's more or less what President Obama has done. I'm not saying, again, that's a good or bad thing. That's just the reality of the case. Now, what disturbs me here, folks, is the context in which all of this is occurring. There was an American geopolitical author by the name of Samuel P. Huntington. He wrote a book called The Clash of Civilizations. And in it, he specifies 6 basic kinds of civilization in existence in the world today. Among them, the Islamic world, then, of course, the Western world. And then finally, he has what he calls the Orthodox civilization, which is primarily represented by Russia. And then, of course, some of the lesser nations, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on in Eastern Europe. Now, it doesn't take long to see that Huntington's vision is a secularized version of the type of interpretive tradition of biblical prophecy that you find within American and some strains of British fundamentalism beginning back in the 19th century. And again, that interpretation is not part of the historic Christian tradition. Now, you see this blending of religion and politics in not only the United States, but you see it, interestingly enough, in Mr. Putin's Russia. And I have, on a number of occasions in various radio shows, spoken to the fact that I do not view Mr. Putin as a neo-Stalinist. And this has subjected me to all sorts of criticism from people in Eastern Europe that complain of Mr. Putin's strong-arm tactics. I want to make it very clear that I do think Mr. Putin is an authoritarian. That number 2, I do think Mr. Putin is using the security services of Russian intelligence and the Russian police to clamp down on domestic enemies. All right? What sets him apart from Mr. Stalin is something that I think makes him more dangerous. And this is that Mr. Putin is coming out of, in my opinion, a tradition within Russia that Stalin himself set up. And this was that bargain that he struck with Metropolitan Sergius Stragorodsky back in 1936. And the provisions of that bargain were effectively that the church would be allowed a minimal existence under the communist regime in return for allowing the then NKVD, the parent organization to the KGB, to recruit clergy for the purposes of domestic spying. I think under Mr. Putin, that regime, the surrounding of Mr. Putin with the trappings of Tsarist symbolism, the Romanov family eagle, and so on and so forth, indicates that Mr. Putin is relying to a certain extent on the deep connection of the Russian Orthodox Church with Russian culture to cement and shore up a domestic regime that is still struggling with economic difficulties. And this is something very significant, and I hope people understand what this means geopolitically. Because in the wake of the, let me back that up. In the 19th century, in the 18th century, and so on, Tsarist Russia, on the basis of the fact that it was an Orthodox power, used that as a means of trying to project geopolitically, trying to project Russian influence into Eastern Europe and other areas where there was an Orthodox Christian presence. This is principally the reason that was used by the Russians prior to World War I to back up Serbia after Austria-Hungary mobilized against Serbia. All right. Again, it was viewed as, and sold, kind of spun to the public, as a means of backing a weaker Orthodox power against the much more powerful Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, I think that if you see where this is going, you have, of course, an Orthodox Christian population presence in Syria. You certainly have it in Israel with the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. You certainly have Orthodox and Coptic Christians in Egypt and so on. Now, if Mr. Putin is successful in reviving this kind of neo-czarist approach to things geopolitically, then this means he could leverage that presence as a means of inserting Russian influence and say-so in areas that have traditionally laid outside of the communist doctrine and communist assertions of spheres of influence. Communism, in other words, couldn't be sold on the international stage. On the other hand, an appearance or pretense at religion, and particularly one with which Russia is identified historically, could be. This is why I think we have to watch Mr. Putin very carefully, because it makes him, in a certain sense, a much more dangerous player than Joseph Stalin could ever hope to be. And I think Putin has very cleverly used his propaganda organs, his practice of Russian Orthodoxy, and so on, to position himself for the long term in precisely that role. All right, it's a way of reasserting Russian claims to spheres of influence in those areas of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. So this is why I have been harping on Mr. Putin. It's not because I believe he is some sort of messiah figure or so on. I believe that this circumstance is massively misunderstood in the West, particularly in the Western media, with its typically secular approach and inability to appreciate the fact that there is a long tradition, a history of religion and culture in Russia that Mr. Putin is attempting, whether successfully or not, I can't say. I think to a certain extent successfully, at least as far as the West is concerned. This is what's going to make him very, very dangerous. Now let's turn back to what I opened up with Israel and Bibi Netanyahu's trip to Beijing and Moscow. Not only does this herald, I think, a new geopolitical awareness in Tel Aviv, that they would reach out to Beijing and Moscow in an attempt to start opening the diplomatic doors to put pressure on Syria from those quarters, because clearly the Obama administration is not playing along with the usual internal domestic politics of the United States in responding to pressures from that religious element in this country vis-a-vis Israel. What we're witnessing, I'm suggesting to you, in the long term is something very dangerous. And that is, we're witnessing the possibilities that we're setting up precisely on a religious basis, that we're setting up precisely that clash of civilizations that Samuel Huntington wrote about in his book, The Clash of Civilizations. And what did he say there? One of the most telling things, I think, that he said was that these clashes of civilizations are going to occur, here it comes, folks, I hope you're listening carefully, on the common surfaces of those civilizations. In other words, along the borders where they interface with each other. All right? And that means the Middle East in particular is going to be the staging area, so to speak, for the conflict of civilizations between the West, between Islam, and between the Orthodox civilization, or if you will, all of the major representatives of any kind of Yahwistic tradition. All right, that's what's being set up. Now, I know that's going to play into certain fears that some of you are probably familiar with. There allegedly was a letter that Albert Pike wrote Giuseppe Mazzini that allegedly was on display in the Old British Museum that was subsequently removed. According to some sources, Pike wrote back in the 19th century that what they were attempting to do, the Illuminati, was set up precisely this clash of civilizations so that they could get rid of the Yahwist traditions altogether and replace them with something else. And that's a suspicion, quite frankly, that I've entertained. It looks to a certain extent like they're attempting to do that. What they're going to attempt to replace it with, I suspect, is something far worse. But from the standpoint, from the long-term, deep perspective that I've tried to bring to these questions, going all the way back to ancient times, I suspect that what you see happening right now is yet another step further away from what I've been calling the metaphor. So when I say watch Mr. Putin, I'm saying watch him not simply because of his being willing to play the counterfoil to the Western elites and challenging their power and authority. But watch him also very carefully for his domestic policies and how he might be tempted to use this kind of what I've been calling Neo-czarist, this kind of imperial type of tyranny rather than the old Stalinist, purely secular, communist, godless atheism, all of that stuff. That type of tyranny. I don't think he's in that mold, although certainly Stalin is a model for him in the use of authoritarian methods. But Stalin's materialistic, atheistic ideology isn't part of that, all right? This is what makes him much more dangerous on the world stage. Now, put all of that into perspective with what I've been saying about the BRICS nations, this realignment that has been taking place against the West on the part of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and most recently South Africa. That falls outside of this religio-geopolitical nexus I've been talking about. So again, that's an argument against the interpretation that I've been advancing. But I do think it is possible that you can combine the two approaches. And I suspect that we're going to see little indicators or hints of that in the coming years. If we don't, then Mr. Putin isn't to be interpreted along the lines I'm suggesting here. If we do see little signs of that, then yeah, it could be that we're dealing with something far more dangerous than the secular Western press imagines. Anyway, that's it for my news and views this week from the Nefarium. I hope that it made some sort of sense to some of you, where I'm coming from, how I'm trying to analyze all of these things going on. We'll see you on the flip side, and God bless everybody.